When it comes to fertilizing our plants, these are our three choices right here. A conventional fertilizer, an organic fertilizer, and a liquid fertilizer. Maybe it's conventional, maybe it's organic, like this fish emulsion. Is there anything else we could use if we wanted to fertilize our plants, to give them nutrients that they need to grow? What else could we provide them? Oh, one more thing. We have compost right here. And compost, while not a true fertilizer, more of an amendment, it does provide a fertilization value. There are nutrients in there that the plant can use in the same way it would use a fertilizer for, so we'll lump it in there. Compost, conventional, organic, and a liquid form of some or all of the above. These are all great ways to give a plant the nutrients it needs to survive. But what's the bad thing about these? Not maybe just the conventional or just the fish emulsion, all of them. What's the downside of them? Just think about that for a second. The downside of these is we have to apply them all the time, more or less forever. Now, I don't mean daily, but seasonally, or with each crop, you're adding fertilizer, you're adding compost. Maybe yearly you're adding fertilizer, you're adding compost. Unless you live by the seashore, you can't make this. You can kind of put this together out of pieces you might have on your homestead, but you can't really make it. You definitely can't make this. And this you can make, but it takes a lot of inputs to make it. Looking at these four, they contain a wide variety of minerals and nutrients that are available to the plant. But the one nutrient that a lot of us seek out, given our soils and given the fact that we want plants to grow, is nitrogen. All of these contain a form of nitrogen that's plant available, either synthetic or natural. So how could we get that plant that we're growing the nitrogen that we want it to have without having to buy this, without having to import this onto our own property, and without having to apply it time after time? Today I have a potential solution to that problem. It's a bit unique. I don't think it's for everybody, but nonetheless it's worth trying. We're going to try and use this. These are Dutch white clover seeds. They're a perennial, they're a nitrogen fixer, and we're going to try and plant them into our annual vegetable garden to give our plants the nitrogen and nutrients they need to grow big and strong. If you've watched my channel for any length of time, you'll know I like to grow one thing in the garden. That's cover crops, and I think cover crops are a great way to build soil. They add sugars to the soil while they're growing, they put biomass into the soil in terms of their root structure, and they produce a lot of above ground biomass, which you can compost in place by just chopping and dropping it, tarping it, or harvesting it and composting it somewhere else. But the bad thing about cover crops is they're cyclical. You have to just keep rinsing and repeating, doing the same thing over and over. And it's not that the seed's expensive, but it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. And if we could use cover crops in a more perennial way and leave them always standing, well, why not do that? One of the most popular concepts in permaculture is stacking functions. And one of the ways stacking functions implements itself in the real world is through something like this, a food forest. Essentially a managed yet natural ecosystem where all the needs of the plants within this forest are provided by the other plants and other organisms living in the forest. It's kind of a self-sustaining system. This is my food forest, and I'm not doing any sort of management in here. I have stone fruit trees, I have a guava tree, there's a pomegranate tree right behind me. You probably can't even tell that these are fruit trees because they're blending in amongst these acacias, and right above the camera, there's a black locust. The great thing about this system is it takes care of itself in a way that doesn't involve me. The system is great for perennials, but could we scale it down to annuals? Could we design a system where the plants within the system and the organisms within the system provide those needs of what was in those jars at the beginning of the video? Could we create a self-fertilizing annual system? Let's take a look at how we're going to try and do that. The new strategy is to take our bed, a bed that we're going to use for our, quote, perennial annuals, long-lived annuals. These aren't the quick turn and burn crops like radishes. These are crops that are going to be in the soil for a relatively long period of time, let's say 90 plus days. Tomatoes, corn, watermelon, kale, broccoli, things that we can just leave here and they'll grow and grow and grow for months. So not short-term crops, what I'm calling the more perennial-ish annuals, longer-term annuals. The benefit of longer-term annuals in this system is there's not turnover. So we don't have to worry about wiping this bed clean. Remember, that was the big issue with using these cover crops, harvesting them and composting them. There's a lot of work. If you're cycling that all the time, you have to do the work to cycle them all the time. You have to keep terminating these cover crops and clearing out the bed surface. You also want a crop that's probably going to grow really high, tall. Tomatoes, corn, makes a lot of sense in this system. Why high? Because what we're going to do is we're going to plant cover crops into this bed. And we're going to use a low-growing cover crop that acts as a perennial. So a perennial cover crop, low-growing. So we could have our tomatoes growing up like this, and then our cover crop would just occupy the understory. With the cover crops planted in here, we can go through and cut out areas to plant our perennial-ish annuals, our tomatoes, into. So in an established system, we would have this carpet of clover, which is what I'm going to be using, Dutch white clover, and eventually it'll fill in the whole bed. It's a carpet that is never terminated completely, and this doesn't work, but it's a carpet that would get cutouts in it periodically when we want to grow crops. Maybe that's a strip, maybe those are holes. Tomatoes are easy, peppers are easy. We could just excavate out a hole large enough to let the tomato or pepper get established into it, let it grow above the understory, and then if the rest of this hole gets filled in with clover, so be it. Who cares? The benefit of this system, in addition to not harvesting, is we're not losing any time. In the previous system, where you're harvesting the cover crop and you're bringing it over to your compost pile, well, what happens in that transition period between harvesting and the next crop establishing itself? There's always going to be this kind of dead zone in between this crop going out and the new crop growing. There's probably a 21-day window before there's enough biomass on surface to start shielding the soil. It's probably another 21 day, it's probably also a 21-day window before these plants get big enough to start exuding sugars into the soil, to start putting out biomass into the soil to feed the biology. Any biology that was living off crop A and really booming because of crop A is no doubt going to slow down once crop A is out of the picture, and at least until crop B comes back online. If this one's pumping out all the sugars, it stops. The biology is going to stop eating those sugars until something else can come back and replace it. So by keeping a perennial cover in the bed, we end up with perennial exudates going into the soil. Roots always in the soil. Living roots always into the soil. Now we're also going to get some die-off of organic matter. When we harvest out these circles, when we harvest out rows where I'm envisioning, just kind of shoveling out a circle, turning the soil over, pulling it back, maybe string trimming some paths really low, maybe that's a mow strip, some way of bringing it down to the soil, well, we're potentially killing some of these plants, which is okay, because those plants, when they die, are going to leave the roots in the soil. But those roots aren't just going to end up in the soil when they're dying. This carpet's also going to produce a ton of roots in the process, a thick carpet of roots underneath the soil. A lot of biomass will be built by these crops over time. We're just going to let them reproduce themselves. We're going to let it fill in, thicken in. And if you think about this, it's kind of operating like the average American lawn. A lawn isn't turned over annually. You grow the lawn, you mow the lawn, Sometimes clover and stuff comes into the lawn. In fact, some people plant clover into their lawn if they're not too much into the herbicides. And it just keeps growing. This is now becoming like a grassland system where we're going to be the herbivore in the system that tramples it, that knocks it down. And we're going to allow biodiversity to happen within reason. So if other kind of plants started showing up in here and they're not interfering with things, I'm going to leave them. So within this grassland, we're going to be able to manage our annuals. So it's this mix of wild meets cultivated by humans. Now that we know the theory in the system, how are we going to make this happen? Well, the quote perennial in the system is going to be tomatoes, a long-lived annual, and the permanent fixture of the garden will be this. This is Dutch white clover. Dutch white clover is going to fix nitrogen. We know that. The idea is that some of that nitrogen that it's fixing is going to spill out into the soil and be available for the tomato or the other, quote, perennial to pick up. So this Dutch white clover is going to be the key to the system. Most legumes can produce enough nitrogen to sustain themselves, where they would need 0 supplemental nitrogen to grow. So the idea here is clover will go into the system self-sufficient. It's like dropping Chuck Norris into the scene in a 1980s movie. He doesn't need a team. He just goes in and does it on his own. He's a one-man warrior. Well, clover is going to be the one-man warrior in terms of a crop. It's not going to need additional nitrogen. It will Chuck Norris its way to success in the bed. Now, we know from science that when the clover grows, nodules will form. Nitrogen will go from the air into the roots. And they've done studies that show that some of that nitrogen leaks out into the soil and can actually be transferred to other plants. So the thought here is clover, Chuck Norrising, self-sufficient in the bed, but yet some of its nitrogen will get kicked out and shared with the tomato plant or the pepper or whatever other vegetable we're growing. Now, I can't depend on this tomato getting 100% of its nitrogen from the clover, but it will likely get some nitrogen from the clover. And we're also getting all sorts of organic matter under here, bacteria that are dying, fungi, which are converting nutrients in the soil. They're liberating a lot of nitrogen, so we're going to get nitrogen from all this biological activity that the clover is really pushing through its root exudates, its sugars. We're going to be getting some nitrogen when we carve out this little hole to grow the tomato, because we're going to kill that plant. We can just let that compost on surface so the tops and the roots can compost there in place. So we would get this cell where clover was growing, and within this cell here, we now have kind of like a chop and drop right there with the roots under the surface, and the tomato goes right in the center. In theory, this should work from a nutrient standpoint. The science says nutrients will transfer. The science says some nitrogen will transfer. And then if enough doesn't transfer, we can supplement. Now that we know that the theory is sound, we could really plug and play in the system with any type of legume. There are a few reasons why I chose Dutch white clover. Number one, it's cheap. It's only about $7 a pound, inexpensive, especially if you're only planting it once. Number two, it's a, quote, perennial. At least it will be out here in California. I think this is gonna stay alive 24/7, 365, year after year, propagating itself, self-seeding. It's not gonna die off because we don't get snow, we don't get frost. Even on the East Coast or more temperate areas where you will get snow, where you do have winter, it still is a perennial. It will just die back over the winter and come back in the spring. In addition to producing seed, it will seed itself in a bed, which is really good. The third reason why I really like this is it only grows to be about 6 to 8 inches tall. That's a nice height in a garden because all of my other, quote, perennial vegetable crops are going to outcompete this in terms of height. You wouldn't want to plant a too short of a crop amongst this, or maybe you could, it might be a challenge, because then they might be competing for light. In this case, the Dutch white clover is going to be the understory plant under a forest of tomatoes. I think that shading effect of tomatoes will actually help this Dutch white clover grow. So we'll see how it grows. And then the fourth reason I'm using this is very vigorous. It's not a dainty cover crop like some legumes out there. You can plant it and go. It's nitro-coated, which is a bonus. That means the inoculant is already on the seed when you plant it, so it's ready to fix nitrogen as soon as it hits the ground. All ingredients are in place, just plant and play. To do the seeding today, I'm going to be using the Jang seeder. I have the M6 roller in here with sprockets 14 in the front, 9 in the back. That's going to give me 4-inch spacing. This is a very tiny seed. It's probably about the size of poppy seed. With this M6 roller, I can get about 6 to 8 seeds per hole in the roller. That's good because I'm really trying to overseed here. I'm going to do a bunch of passes up and down on either side of the row of tomatoes. I'm not worried about wasting seed. It's cheap. I really want this to establish, hence why I'm using a larger roller to drop more seed. These are the actual beds where this trial is going to happen. It's not the best soil in these beds, which is why I want to do it on these beds. I have the tomatoes straight down the center. On either side is where I'm going to be trying to establish the rows of the Dutch white clover. What you see on the ground here, this is rye that was a previous cover crop that I planted over the winter. This is just what's left of the biomass on the surface. I'm going to use the double disc opening shoe on the Jang to just try and cut through this, and I'm just going to go back and forth, maybe down, back, so 4 laps on either side to try and get enough seed in the ground, and then water it in really good and hope the birds don't get it. And at the end of the day, if all goes well, we'll start out with bushy clover on the outside, tomatoes in the center, and then that clover will naturally start to fill itself in. At the end of the day, will this work? I'm not sure. My gut says it will. I think it's going to be more challenging than I expect. I kind of feel like this is pretty straightforward. It should work okay. What are the big potential negatives I see, or the things to worry about? One, maybe this plant right here gets choked out by these other plants. Maybe not just above surface, but maybe below surface. Is that a problem? It could be. Maybe there's just too much competition for nutrients within the soil. So you need a big tomato plant, which is going to suck up a fair amount of nitrogen relative to a smaller clover plant. Is there going to be competition for nutrients there? We'll see. We could always amend from the top with granular fertilizer, with any sort of liquid fertilizer spray, to supplement the needs of the perennial and the annual. Other potential worries in the system, one is the clover just goes out of control. It just takes over everything. That's not necessarily a bad thing if this works. If it doesn't work, then I have a problem on my hands and I'm gonna just have to terminate this. I can always mow it down, tarp it, and I'm not afraid to use a one-time shot of Roundup to kill it if I needed to, just to start fresh. But I don't think it's going to have to go that far. I don't think we're going to have to spray anything. I don't think we're going to have to terminate anything. I think going at it like this, with this perennial annual system on a small scale, has some promise, and I think it's going to work. So there we have it. The clover is seeded and the experiment has begun. The science is sound here. I think the theory is sound. I think it could work. We'll see how it all plays out in reality. I will do update videos on this throughout the summer. If you're doing something like this, or if you tried this in the past, please let me know. I'd love to know how it worked out for you. Just, leave a comment in the comment section below. Thanks for watching this one. Until next time, be nice, be thankful, and do the work.